Yes, sir. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I know technically by typical Church of Christ Standard Time that we are about 10 minutes early, but but as you guys have probably noticed, as we've jumped into a lot of this content, there is just so much to unpack every single week, right? There's so much for us to be able to do to talk about the richness of the Word. So first question on here, when you think about our study so far since the beginning of the year, what are some ways in which you've noticed God continue to remind his people about who he is? So going all the way back to Genesis, all the way back to the start of our year, what are some ways in which God continues to remind his people about who he is? Jeremy.
First one that jumps in my mind, because I actually thought about going back and counting this physically, but how many times God reminds that I am God who led you out of it. Don't forget, I'm the God who led you out of Egypt. Right? Makes you want to start counting. How many times?
Yeah.
I am the Lord your God. Yeah.
I am the Lord. And I'll tell you, spoiler, we're going to look at just a segment of some of that today, right? The continual reminder, if you didn't hear Jeremy said just the number of times that God uses phrase similar to, I am the Lord your God, or I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. How many times that continues to show up? Other thoughts, other ways in which you've seen God reminding his people about who he is.
He lets them know when he's displeased.
Stan said what?
He lets them know when he's displeased.
He definitely lets them know when he is displeased, right? I'm displeased with something that's happening. Other thoughts? Yes, sir.
He lets me know that when I follow his instruction, he blesses me.
If you follow my instructions, I will bless you, right? We see that in Romans, right? In Romans 8:28, God works for the good for all those that love him, right? So when we do, and just like we've seen in our study so far, when we do what God has asked us to do, we are blessed. Israel is actually blessed when they follow his commandments. And so we kind of hit on this already. I want to keep this at the forefront because something that you probably picked up about me and my teaching style is I do try to keep at the center of our classes this idea that God wrote the Bible for us, but he did not write the Bible to us, right? This idea that we weren't the original audience. And so for us to be able to truly understand, we got to try to put ourselves in that mindset. And one of the things that we kind of hit on, I know Jeremy just hit on, is this idea of story, pattern, repetition, right? Over and over again, we see this reminder, this pattern, this repetition that God puts in front of his people. And I would want to put in front of you today that we spent a lot of time looking at the tabernacle, right, leading up to the Exodus, Leviticus. We've been spending a lot of time looking at the tabernacle, the instructions on how it was built. But I would actually present to you this morning that not only was the tabernacle a place in which God dwelt with his people, because it definitely was, right? God came in the Holy of Holies. But not only was it that, but if you look a little bit closer at the tabernacle, at the construction of the tabernacle, it's actually an echo of the creation story itself, right? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over this. One thing, if you're new to the class, you can always capture this web address right here, and that'll take you to this presentation, my notes, so you can always go back and look deeper. I know sometimes we go a little bit quicker because of a lot of the content, but what you'll see, just highlighting some things, there's a creation pattern, right? So in Genesis, we talked about the creation, but in Exodus, if you go and count the number of times that God gives Moses instructions about the tabernacle, he says, the Lord said to Moses, that happens 7 different times. Right, then the Lord said to Moses, about the tabernacle. You see things about at the end, the work was finished. God saw it was good. They finished the work. Moses saw, he blessed his people. It was good. So you see cherubim guarding the access to Eden, right, where God placed the cherubim in the east. Right, the tabernacle always had to face to the east. There were cherubim on the ark, and so again, not going to spend a ton of time on this. But what I would suggest to you is if you look a little bit closer, the tabernacle is not just the place where God dwells with his people, but it was an echo, it was a repetition of the story of creation and Eden. This idea that I'm going to continually remind you of the creation. And so if that tabernacle then is a reminder about creation, then when we look at the book of Leviticus, it's really about how we can maintain Eden, right? One of the things that you might notice about the story of the Bible at large, it's about our and God's story about reclaiming Eden, about getting back to God. And so Leviticus 1-7 is about atonement, right? How to repair the relationship to stay in God's space, right? So we know that after the fall, there was a sacrifice that had to be made in order for them to be covered from their sins, right? So it includes guidance on how that we can atone for a nation. When we look at Leviticus 8-10 and 21-22, then we get to the priesthood. So we talked about atonement. How do we make things right? How do we restore the relationship? Then we look at the priesthood. Adam was given jobs and about boundaries. Remember, we talked about boundaries when we talked about Genesis. And then in this section, in 8-10 and 21-22, we see the job outlined for the priests. So ultimately, Leviticus is about teaching Israel how to protect a sacred space, a sacred time, and how to have sacred community, excuse me, so that the Holy One can dwell in their midst, right? So I want you to keep that at the forefront as we unpack the rest of Leviticus today. So yes, it has a lot of rules, a lot of regulations, a lot of the things, but it's all about how then do we maintain a relationship with a holy God, right? How then do we atone? How then are we to conduct ourselves, the priesthood, to keep the sacred space, sacred time, sacred community? And so again, as with everything, if you weren't able to read this week, no problem. We're going to get you caught up today. And then the goal is today, go ahead and pick up with Sunday's reading, right? Go ahead and pick up with March 1 today if you haven't been keeping up with the reading. And then we'll go through this week. So a couple of things we're going to talk about, the holiness of life, looking at blood and boundaries. We're going to be looking at priestly holiness and things that are set aside as holy things. Looking at holy times, sacred rhythms of life. Caring for the oppressed. And then we'll end our time looking at how then do we live in an ordered camp as a consecrated people, right? Starting and kicking off into Numbers at the tail end of this week's reading. So starting out with our first one, we really want to look at the holiness of life and blood and boundaries. So that's Leviticus 17-20. So I'm going to start with this question. Some of you grew up in the church, some of you didn't. Some of you come to faith early on in life, some a little bit later in life. But this idea of holiness is something that has stuck around for a while. So from your perspective, what does it mean to be holy? Set apart. What does that mean?
Probably like for God's purpose.
Set apart for God's purpose. Okay.
Imitate God.
Imitating God. Okay, I'm holy if I imitate God. Other thoughts?
Not looking like the rest of the world.
Not looking like the rest of the world. And I love that. I want you to hold on to that because I think that's going to come echoing back to us in this week's reading, right? Not being like the rest. Okay, what else? Set apart for God, acting like God. Other thoughts?
I'm being afraid to say that, hey, I'm a Jew.
Not being afraid to say that I'm a Christian. Not being afraid to say, hey, I'm a little bit different than the world.
I wore a shirt to get groceries the other day, and it was a Kingwood Church Christ shirt. I got 2 different comments on how they appreciated that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Right. So even putting something on to show that you're set apart. Okay, so I know it's a lot of text. I'm just going to summarize some of this for you. Right, so when we think about Leviticus, I think sometimes we get bogged down in the rules and regulations. But keep in mind, it's not just about this idea of private morality, like how am I as an individual meant to live, but it's about living safely near a holy God in which a space cannot be defiled. Right, God cannot be in the presence of things that are defiled or unholy. So I want you to think about it this way. In ancient Near Eastern thought, right, so you think about the Hebrew culture and everywhere else that was surrounding them at the time, whenever a god, right, whenever a deity of some sort dwells in a place, that place now is considered charged. There's something else to it. It's not normal anymore, right? So normal no longer applies. So if I could frame it for us, I want you to think about, for us, a hospital operating room, right? Or think about a high security lab or compound. When you think about those sorts of environments for us, the regular rules no longer apply, right? I know at minimum we've got several healthcare workers in here, right? You don't walk into an OR, you don't walk into an operating room in your just general clothes, right? And there's a reason for that. Any of our medical professionals want to talk about just briefly why we can't just wear street clothes into the OR?
Because it's a place where it has to be sterile and pristine,
Has to be sterile and pristine.
and you don't want to, what I would say, invest or.
Can't infect that space, right? Or bad things happen, right? You don't intend. I might not have intended for bad things to happen, right? I want to go into this operating room because I love this person. I want to be with them, but I'm just going to wear my street clothes. Right? Unfortunately, I just gave them an infection of some sort, right? But I didn't intend to, but bad things could still happen, right? Because it has to be, I would submit to you, this same holds true. Whenever God dwells in a space, the normal rules no longer apply, right? And so there's this idea of holiness. You see this example whenever God tells Moses, hey, take off the sandals because the place where you're standing is holy ground, right? Whenever he goes ready to go up to Mount Sinai, God tells Moses, hey, place barriers and limits because whoever touches the mountain is going to be put to death. This is not the idea of like God bringing about judgment, but the idea that the normal doesn't apply. God cannot be around things that are defiled by the very nature of God. So when you think about this, what are some of the things about that you think we miss in our culture and our context today?
I think a lot of our culture today is about elevating me.
Yeah.
And making me the decision maker.
Yeah.
Me in control.
Yes, if you didn't hear that, a lot of our culture today might be more about us. And let me be very clear, let's frame it, right? There's no right or wrong, right? If you ever think about culture, you're not talking about, is it a right or wrong? It's different. Our culture, American culture, is different than the early ancient Near East in that we tend to look at more of the individual. There's trade-offs. Sometimes it's great, right? Sometimes that leads to great things with individual liberty, and sometimes not. Right? In the same way here with the ancient Near East culture, sometimes there are things that were great about a more communal aspect of life. And there's trade-offs, sometimes not. Absolutely. See, so one of the key takeaways here, hopefully, is that we understand that God's presence is good. God is dwelling with his people, but it's not casual, right? And Israel and the Hebrew people and us can't treat it as casual. Proximity demands order, reverence, and proper handling, right? Just this idea that when God enters into a space, it shouldn't be normal anymore. It shouldn't be just run of the mill anymore.
He was preparing them to go into the land of Canaan. It's kind of like he's saying, don't sacrifice your children. It's probably the last thing they had in mind. And he knew they were going to go in and mix it up with a lot of ugly cultures.
Absolutely. Stan said that God is preparing his people to go into Canaan, into the promised land, right? And he's like, maybe they weren't even thinking about that, but he knew that it was around them. And so he is preparing them to go into that land. Stan, I love that you brought that up because we are going to get into that for sure. Okay, so we get then later into Leviticus 17, 18, this idea of blood, right? Blood is life. We see this theme in the text. The life of the creature is in its blood. And then that life belongs to God. So this idea of blood isn't about, oh, it's gross or it's dirty. It's about this idea that God owns the blood. God owns the life. And so when you think about that, why then would eating blood, sorry, my typo, blood feel like taking what belongs to God, not just breaking a food rule. What do you think? If blood is life and that life belongs ultimately to God, why would eating blood feel like taking what belongs to God, not just breaking a food rule?
Take a crack at it.
Yes, sir.
Because, that's, it's not a breaking a food rule because it's not the purpose for which blood was created.
Right?
Blood was created, obviously, that it's now for circulation, for life, you have to supply that blood with oxygen and with, all the things that it needs to make us who we are.
Yeah. It serves a specific purpose, right? The blood serves a specific purpose in an animal and in a living thing. And so that should be treated with reverence. Right? We talked about this already. It represents life itself. So when we think about this idea of sacrifice, God calls people to sacrifice. It's not about magic. There's no mystical thing that happens whenever sacrifice occurs. It's this transfer back to the life giver in a way that God has appointed. All life, all blood, all of it ultimately belongs to God. And when God calls for sacrifice, He's saying, putting it into perspective, you are returning back to me what is rightfully mine. And when you go into Leviticus, it goes even into the stake that it has to be done in a way that God appointed them to. So let's go to Leviticus 17, 3 through 7. If you're following along it's page 211 in this version, right? But February 22nd. What do you notice about 3 through 7? No, don't read it, but what do you know? Is there anything you notice?
Well, one of them's like talked about is Moses giving specific instructions, and if they're not followed, separation occurs, being separated from God and the community.
Mm-hmm. That very first line, if anyone sacrifices where? Outside the bounds of what God?
Outside of them, instead of bringing it to the tabernacle.
Instead of the entrance to the tabernacle. Right? Because I think one of the things that you kind of jump off into is if all blood belongs to God and we're returning life to God, well, then why can't that just happen anywhere? Right? But again, God gets very specific here. It says, no, you shouldn't just be doing this out in the fields. You shouldn't just be slaughtering things and thinking you're doing good because you're spilling blood. Right? God gives a very set purpose here. So again, sacrifice has to be made at God's altar, not out in the open fields. So it's not just about dietary restrictions. It's about honoring the person who ultimately owns all life. Right? So when we jump into this, yeah, it's a lot of rules, but why do these rules exist? Why is God framing it like this?
When you first began, I just couldn't help but think about in John where Jesus said, "You're going to drink my blood." And that would be why they were so resistant to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I know we probably discussed it before, right? But at the Last Supper, Jesus said, "Take and drink. This is my blood." And as Hebrew people, they would be like, "What are you talking about? Why am I doing that?" Well, the very life of an animal is in the blood. We are taking the life of Jesus into ourselves, right? So absolutely. Linda.
To get off of 17, I want to, I maybe don't want to notice this. It's me, but, in several places in Leviticus, and especially in here on 17, verse 7, it says, "This is a permanent law for them, to be observed from generation to generation. And the reason I thought about that so much is because of when the law is turned over, when Jesus
Mhm.
dies on the cross. And I recognize that. But I just thought it was interesting that word, and maybe it's because in some of the other versions I read, the word permanent is not the one they use.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll just be upfront and I say I don't know that I've done that specific of a study into the phrasing permanent law, but what I would remind us of, and we've talked about this before, is remember this is covenant language, right? I think we talked a little bit about this idea of covenants already, but this is very much covenant language. These are the terms of the covenant. So to hold up your part of it, this is the stipulation part of that covenant, right? Again, Linda, I don't know if that specifically answers it.
It just was interesting to me, and I know that we're under totally new law.
Right. Yep.
But I just found that interesting. I don't know if maybe it's this translation. I've just been getting used to the NLT.
Mhm.
Maybe that's why I think.
Yeah.
See presented that way. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, unfortunately, I don't know that I've got a full set of answers specific to that one for you. All right, so let's talk about boundaries here. So we're jumping ahead now to Leviticus 18:24 through 28. I will jump us ahead a little bit quicker here, right? But when you think about Leviticus 18, God starts out with this: give the following instructions to the people of Israel. I am the Lord your God. Do not act like the people in Egypt where you used to live, or like the people of Canaan where I'm taking you. So this is going exactly to where Stan brought up earlier, right? You're getting ready to enter into the promised land. So what does it mean that chapter is introduced as kind of anti-Egypt and anti-Canaan? So instead of God just saying, hey, here's some rules I need you to follow, right? In chapter 18, later on, we get into a lot of different things that are forbidden, things that they should and shouldn't do. Instead of God just saying, hey, here's some things that you should and shouldn't do, he says, hey, I'm the Lord. Don't act like Egypt and don't be like Canaan. Why does he frame it like this?
Because if they do, the land would be defiled.
If you do, the land will be defiled. Sure, absolutely. Absolutely
The land
will.
belongs to God.
And the land belongs to God. Yes, sir.
They probably understand what Egypt is like.
Yeah.
It's a good reference to them for practical purposes.
Yeah. They knew what Egypt's like. They just came from there.
Going back to the separate and apart, if you give rules, we know with the Jewish people, they find loopholes, they find ways to break rules, they find the nondescript rule that they can do. I think if you just make the blanket statement of the opposite of,
Yeah.
tie this, that can compute in I know what that is, so it can't be that.
Right. Right. It makes it very real. Makes it very real for them. Right. Go ahead.
Maybe it's also, when he says the land will, and maybe we can discuss that, land vomiting them up, it means, as you're saying, that this is my land. And these groups that have lived here are not worthy of it, therefore they're being,
They're being pushed out. They're being vomited out. Right. Absolutely. I think everybody's kind of hit on all this, right? We know that the Israelites knew about the cultures around them. They just came out of Egypt. They knew about the culture in which they were going to. God is very much telling them, I'm asking you to live in a completely different culture. Be different. Be holy. Be set apart, right? The culture shapes how we worship and the ethics of a culture. Think about us in our day and age right now. Our culture is defined by our worship, our belief system. It defines our ethics, right? If we weren't here right now, right, and if we weren't Christians, how would we be living? We'd be living shaped by our culture. And so the word, just to unpack it, right, this Hebrew word, I'm going to butcher it because I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but the word tameh, the word defile is that Hebrew word. It is moral impurity. It's not temporary, right? It's not this like, the land has become dirty, temporarily dirty. It's about corruptions of the space at the deepest level. And remember what we said, God is creating in Leviticus. This is the manual on how to live with me in your presence. This is the manual. I can't be around things that are not wholly set apart. If the land is defiled, if you cause this to defile, which we know in Israel's history, that's coming. But he's like, I can't dwell with you. Phyllis.
All of these things that he's talking about before this though are sins of the body.
Mhm.
And because the body is his temple, we need to, that's why he wants us to obey that.
Absolutely. Not only that, and I'll build on that, right? Not only is it physical, but it's communal in nature. It's not just the individual defilement, but it's about things in the community. If you think about some of those regulations, there's things that can tear down the very fabric of their society. Yes, sir.
He's God and he wants everything to work properly.
Mhm.
He's teaching us to have our maximum potential. He's the maker of a thing, so he tells you how it operates. And if we do what he says to do, we receive the great result.
Absolutely, right? Who else but the designer of life is going to know exactly how it operates, right? I tend to use this example, even though it's well over my head. But anybody who's an engineer on an engine, they know exactly how that engine works. They know what fluids, what things they engineered for it. And so they say, put this in it, right? And so if I run a car that's supposed to run on premium and I put just regular unleaded in it and I get some engine knocking, well, I put into it something that wasn't supposed to be there, right? So Leviticus 18 takes this idea of unclean. It's not just an individual, defilement. It's this covenant pollution. It can spread beyond just the person into the community, the land, which then leads to exile, which is why God is kicking these people out of Canaan, right? The land has become defiled because of things that have happened there. And so this goes back to what Jeremy pointed out earlier. In Leviticus 19 and 20, we see more about holiness in community. How many times do you see this phrase, I am the Lord, just in 19 and 20? Again, I'm not going to ask for a hard answer, but but hopefully you're noticing that phrase comes up quite a bit. Every other line, every 3 lines or so, I am the Lord, your God. I'm the Lord, your God, who brought you up out of Egypt. Again, it's the repetition, but for this culture, this is covenant language. This is an agreement that they have said. So God is putting in front of them, I'm the Lord your God. I'm the Lord your God, because we have a covenant together.
I would say another point on that is, has anyone in here bought a house? How many times do you have to sign your name?
Yeah.
So it's God signing each, to me, it's God signing each line of this contract.
Yeah, I love that. I've never thought about that, right? If you ever close on a house, you're signing your life away. But it's very much like buying a house is basically, it's a covenant, it's a contract. I'm agreeing to these terms, right? It's the same thing. God, if I'm putting my name on you, if I'm putting my name on you, Israel's my chosen people, here's the terms, here's the terms, here's the terms. I love that. I love that. Right? So living as holy people is revering God, but it's also, right? It's not just this individual, I love God, I'm going to revere God, but it's caring for the poor, being honest in business, loving your neighbor. If you look at what's underlying here in Leviticus 19 and 20, that's what these rules are about, is how do I live a life? So when you think about Leviticus 19, what do you see between the connection with worship and Israel's economy? Right, I'll give you some examples. When you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your field. Do not steal. Do not deceive or cheat one another.
Excuse me.
Do not defraud.
The repetition of I am the Lord kind of shows how we're slow learners.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We absolutely are. Because I would submit to you, and we're gonna get there. We will get there. What we see in the Old Testament, guess what we're gonna see in the New Testament? And I think sometimes we gloss over this, right? We get lost in the rules and the regulation, but one of the things that I was very much convicted of this week specifically, I was like, this is not an unfair God. This is not an angry God. This is a God that says, I want to dwell with you. I want to be with you, and here's how we can make this happen. That's not an angry God. That's an angry God that very much wants to be with his people. Right? Yes.
I agree 100%. Not only slow learners, but we have amnesia. We have a human condition called amnesia.
Yeah.
We very, very quickly forget.
Yeah.
I mean, greatest example I think of is the Israelites themselves, they were off doing wrong things no more than days after the Red Sea was parted and all of his chariots were destroyed. It's like,
Yeah, you just saw the hand of God at work, and we forget.
yeah, we're guilty of the same thing.
Absolutely, we are.
Pointing fingers at them.
Absolutely, we are. Yeah. So this idea of holiness, and again, we're in section 1, just to be clear, right? Section 1 of 5. So this idea of holiness is not just this abstract, like I love God, I'm set apart, but it's seeing how do you live it out? It's seeing how is power used, especially towards the vulnerable, right? We see that pure faith is this, taking care of the widows and orphans, the vulnerable. Israel's holiness is not this abstract idea. You can publicly see it and you can measure it by how they treat the most vulnerable people of their society, right? And we'll even see it in how their camp is set up in numbers, in how they set up their camp and how they travel together. How are you taking care of the most vulnerable? Okay, second, when you think about holiness, I'm going to actually gloss over this one because I think we've hit this idea a lot. When you think about the rules in Leviticus 21:22, it's about the priestly laws, a lot of priestly laws. Those that were closest to God seem to have the most strict rules, right? And again, I'm just carry this forward to the New Testament. We even see the same thing, right? The teachers, elders are called to be, they will be held to account, right? Elders, teachers, like we are held to account for these things because ultimately, this idea of if you are going to be the closer you are, the more charged it is, the higher the accountability it is. Okay, going to section 3 again. Sorry, brushing through here. We've got a lot. So in Leviticus, now we're in 23:24. We've seen this idea of where, right? The tabernacle is holy. How you set it up is holy. The camp is holy. So we've seen holiness regarding where. We've seen holiness in regards to who, the priests. So ultimately, what's missing here when you look at 23 and 24? Why is because I'm the Lord your God. How you should do it are the rules and regulations. When the word here, Leviticus 23:2, moed, right? These are the Lord's appointed festivals. The word there is moed. This same word shows up in Leviticus 1:14, the same Hebrew word moed. It's not actually this idea of these are the appointed festivals. It's the same word for seasons, right? When the word moed in Genesis, the lights will mark the signs and the seasons for you, the time. So when we get into 23:24, those festivals, God says, look, I've told you where I will dwell in your camp. I'm telling you who is called to be holy. I'm telling you how to live this life. But now let's talk about when. What does this look like in seasons, in times? God ordains for them to be holy. So when you think about it, the surrounding nations, the Egyptians, the Canaanites, they use their festivals for fertility, prosperity, order. They viewed deities as kind of these powers that just kind of abstractly deal with people, right? They're not involved with people. But when you think about Israel's festival calendar, What does it teach them about trust instead?
I think it teaches them about God's provision and protection and his holiness.
Yeah. God's provision, God's protection. God will provide. Again, this is a very personal God. This is not a God or gods that bicker with each other, that because they're arguing, that's where we get thunderstorms from, right? This is not this. This is a God that says, I will provide for you. I see you as my precious possession that I will provide for you. For a lot of other cultures at that time, this idea of God or gods, it was about appeasing the gods. It was about manipulating the gods to do what they want. But instead, we see a very personal God that says, I want you to remember that, right? Because to Hugh's point, we forget. People forget. And God says, I'm going to bake it into your calendar that this is when you will absolutely remember. And so we see that in some of the redeeming feasts, the weekly Sabbaths. And so when you look at the laws that are outlined here at the end of Leviticus, how do they make sure Israel never becomes Egypt to one another? They were slaves in Egypt.
And I guess that implies that maybe they better not have children.
Maybe it implies, but it does allow for, right? It does say in Leviticus, treat your slaves this way.
True.
Okay? Just to build some context, if you're looking, Leviticus 25 through 27, this is where we see things like, it's the year of Jubilee.
And the Sabbath every 7 years.
You have to land Sabbaths every 7 years. So on the 50th year, 7 sets of 7, on the 50th year, the land has to rest. What does this do, Linda?
This says, does too, is that it's for, the laws are for everyone.
Yes.
And in Egypt, it was different.
Yeah.
Because one law for one law for another, but this was for everybody.
I love that, right? These laws apply to everyone. The priests, the rulers, the people. You didn't get special treatment here, right?
Nadab and Abihu can testify.
Yeah, even the priests, Nadab and Abihu, they were the priests. They didn't, and they treated God in a very casual way, right? Maybe drawing some conclusions here, but did it in a way that God did not instruct, right? And there were consequences to that. One of the things that I would submit to you is in Egypt, one of the things that they were so ingrained and used to was this idea of production. As slaves in Egypt, it was about your quota of bricks, right? Even remember going back to the Exodus story when Moses first comes and tells them, let my people go. Pharaoh says, hey, take away their straw, but your number of bricks has to remain the same. They were used to this idea. In Egypt, the culture was all about how much can you produce. And this is a God that's saying your value is not defined by how much you produce or how much you make. Your value is defined by the fact that you are my people. And so this idea of rest, which is why he bakes into their calendar Sabbaths and festivals. But specific to the year of Jubilee, whenever you let the land rest, you had to trust that the land would still give you what you needed. So instead of just producing on your own, I'm having to rely on the fact that God in this year will still provide for us and take care. Right? This idea of Jubilee, if you didn't get to read it, just to summarize for you, is that at a certain point, right, the times that people sold themselves into slavery or sold land, at the year of Jubilee, they always marked how much it would cost by how many years was left until the year of Jubilee. Because the year of Jubilee is everything would revert back to that family line. People were set free in the year of Jubilee. What does that do compared to Egypt's system?
Rest in Egypt.
No rest in Egypt.
I see it as a kind of a reset of forgiveness, that you don't have to continue suffering or whatever for the end of the future. You can start over.
Right.
Burdened down by the sin.
Yeah. You're not going to get sucked in. You're not going to get burdened down forever, right? There's a set end to it. I would, again, submit to you that this idea of Jubilee, especially in their economy, is about the marginalized, the oppressed, because what happens to people, right, economically, whenever they can't survive? Well, let me sell you my land. Let me sell you me as a slave for you. God is putting a system in place here that says, even if that happens to you, there's an end in sight. So it's not about this idea that God hates wealth. God hates people becoming disenfranchised. It's about making sure families can still remain intact and they don't just end up fading away. Lineages don't end up fading away. Dr. Green.
Start two things here. One is, yes, and these laws of work and so forth are teaching them to trust God. It is, okay, why, in a worldly view, and we've seen this creep into our own culture. Oh, well, we must work every day. Or let's open the stores on Sunday or whatever, so we can make some more. Well, you really don't.
Right.
To spread it out. And then they are trusting God, especially in those 7th years and the Jubilee, so forth. He's going to take care of them on that 7th year. You're going to produce enough that if you save it as you should, you're going to have plenty of food that 7th year.
Right.
And the other thing was about, and that I've kind of noticed in this, being a Jewish was, and I don't know how necessarily you would figure out what tribe you're going to be in, but it would be, you could become a Jew if you followed the law, became circumcised. You know, we see many examples of this. So that, anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
I mean, you counter that if you saw it differently.
no, absolutely. And we see it in the text, right? Because a lot of the times in the text we see this also applies to the foreigners living among you, right? Remember, when they came out of Egypt, there were plenty of people that came with them because they're like, well, I see it. I see your God. Your God's the one. I'm coming with you, right? Again, I don't know how it was decided either which tribe. I'm assuming they, whatever household they were with, they became part of that tribe, possibly. So again, it's this idea that God cares for and wants to keep at the center this idea of the disenfranchised, right? Because economically, you came out of a place where your value is based off of how much you could produce. So don't forget those that can't. Don't forget those that can't take care of themselves. We see this again echoing in time in Acts, when all the believers had everything in common, right? They sold their possessions to take care of those that had need. Right? God keeps at the center of that idea. All right, so now let's get into Numbers. I've got 10 minutes to get us into the start of Numbers. So the Pentateuch, just to give some vocab here, the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible, right? So when you think about the Pentateuch, so if Genesis is the preface, right? It's the preface of the story. God is choosing his family. Exodus is about how he rescues. Good Lord, can you tell I typed this late? God rescues and forms his people in Exodus. Leviticus becomes the operating manual, right? Numbers then is about the case study. What does this look lived out? What do we do when life happens? God has given them the manual in Leviticus. Numbers now is that narrative of how does this live out? In fact, I think sometimes we miss out on understanding all this because we view it as the book of Numbers, and we've named it that way because of the census that was taken. But if you look at the Hebrew name for the book, it actually means in the wilderness. right? The actual Hebrew name of that book is describing their experience in the wilderness. So it's not just about statistics, right? It's not just about the census, right? It's about their formation in the wilderness, them living out of God's call.
Mistranslated or?
I don't know that we mistranslated it. Yeah, and I don't know that I got rationale as to why. Again, what I found was it was named Numbers because of the census. Now, I don't know why we didn't just use the Hebrew of like in the wilderness. I don't know the answer to that one. Okay, so yes, sir.
Could it be that, you know, the wilderness is not only the woods or the forest, you could be in the middle of the city, you know, they say when in Rome, live in Rome.
Yep.
You be in the city and everybody's just buck wild and you set apart, so you.
Yeah, the wilderness could be anything that's untamed, if you will, right? Okay. So I know I'm jumping a little bit ahead because we only got into the first part of Numbers, but I want you to flip to Numbers 26 and compare it to Numbers 1. So Numbers 1 was actually in, we started it on February 26th, according to the reading. What do you notice in Numbers 1 and Numbers 26? You don't have to look in detail, but structurally, what do you see both in Numbers 1 and Numbers 26?
One, there was fewer men ready for battle in 26.
Fewer men. Again, I'm going to ask you to zoom out a little bit, right? So we don't need to look at details, even though, yes, that is correct. We see fewer men at the end. But let's zoom out broader. What is that? It's a census. Numbers 1 and Numbers 26. The bookends of Numbers includes a census. Includes a census that was taken. And not only that, but if you look deeper, Numbers 1 and Numbers 26, who's not there in Numbers 26? Pretty much everyone in Numbers 1, except for Joshua and Caleb, right? Because this is where we get into the spies going into the land. This is where we get the reports coming back. So the census is theology. This is their wilderness formation. We see a group of people entering into the story. We see how life has happened to them. And then at the end, there's another census taken, and it shows that the entire generation has been turned over. The entire people have been turned over. You will not enter into the promised land because of some of the things that have occurred here. And this is where I think some of us, at times, I struggle with this, is God is calling a people group, not just saving individuals. Do we have a very personal God that loves us on a very personal and individual level? Yes. And it is also true that God is calling a people group to him. This is about forming a nation for himself. So when you think about it at the beginning of Numbers, just trying to visualize, this is where the tribes pitch their tent in relation to the tabernacle, right? So the directions that you see, the instructions that you see there, this is how kind of they were lined out. So you had Moses, Aaron behind Judah, Zebulun, Issachar. This is the east side of the camp down here. I know the orientation is a little bit different than what we're used to, right? So but when you look a little bit closer, at this looks nice and clean, but Numbers also includes the count of each of the tribes, right? How big each tribe was. And so I did find a very interesting graphic that I wanted to share. When you look at it and you take into account the size of each of the tribes, it could appear something closer to this. Any initial thoughts on that? See, look, I'm not saying that it was intentional or not intentional. Like I said, as I was studying and came across, I was like, what? You see the cross? right? And again, this is just a scale of numbers. When you look at the numbers listed on how big the tribes are, right? That's kind of relative to Hugh.
I was thinking more militarily. I was
That-
thinking like like, hey, this is formation.
And absolutely it is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The numbers is not just about the theology. It's not just about the count. It's about they're about to enter into the promised land on a military campaign. The structure and order, the banners under which they would organize.
Ambush.
Mhm.
You can attack from any direction, whatever.
Yeah.
It may be.
Absolutely. So then I kind of look a little bit closer at this. Leah's sons here. And what I try to do is I try to color code, right? So Zilpah and Leah share a similar coding because Zilpah was Leah's maidservant, right? And Bilhah and Rachel, right? So remember, Bilhah was Rachel's maidservant here. Whenever they would break camp, they'd break camp and travel in from the east, right? These tribes would be the first to travel, Judah leading the way as far as that goes. But keep in mind, when we go back to the story of Rachel and Leah, who was the favored wife? Rachel. But yet salvation came through Leah's line. I think it was Cliff at the very beginning of months ago, where we see this, or maybe it was Chase. It was this idea of choosing the second, right? God shows this pattern of taking typical structural dynamics and turning it on its head. And so Leah, being the not favored wife, her descendants are placed into positions of authority here, even in structurally how they set up camp. The other thing I would point out to you is when they would travel, I think it went this way. It would go east, south, north, east, south, west, then north. And Dan, the tribe of Dan, is actually instructed to bring up the rear, right? And they were specifically called to bring up the rear to protect those that couldn't keep up, the vulnerable, right? Because the Amalekites, right, who are in this area, the Amalekites would attack from the rear. They would attack the most vulnerable. And again, you kind of see echoes of what we talked about, right? God says, my people, your holiness can be seen through how you treat the most vulnerable amongst you. And so Dan, the tribe of Dan, is actually instructed to protect and guard those that were trailing behind because they couldn't keep up. And so as we close, one of my just closing thoughts for us is that our God has not stopped living with imperfect people, right? He's just moved from a tent in the camp to a people as temple. I think Phyllis said this earlier. So think about every single thing that we just talked about earlier, right? These rules weren't arbitrary. It was about a holy God, unable to be in a space that is defiled by his very nature, cannot be in a defiled space. And so he gave them these rules so he could be with them. And yet through the Bible, we see, and especially at the sacrifice of Christ, we see God moving from being external to being able to dwell with us and in us. And it's only through the sacrifice of Christ that occurs, because that his blood washes us to the point where Jesus can dwell in us. His spirit can dwell in us and not in a tent, right? As always, capture the slides, capture the notes. Please go back and double check me. Again, I will always say I'm not a biblical scholar at all, right? I'm just a guy that reads and tries to pull some of the sources together, always open to other thoughts. Let's pray, and then we'll be done for today. God, we thank you for this time that we get to have together to dig into your word, and we thank you that you've given us this opportunity to be able to put a goal and challenge in front of us to get to know you better within this year by looking through every single of your words, every single book, every single word, every single sentence that you are asking us to get to know you and your nature. And God, we thank you for this opportunity to look at Leviticus, maybe in a different light, not as a set of rules, not just as a set of guidelines, but this idea of how you choose to dwell with your people. And God, as we live our lives in a way, help us to be holy, help us to be concentrated, help people to be able to see us as different for your glory. And we pray this all in your son's name. Amen. All right, thank you all.